Well, good evening. My name is Charles Felix. I'm the co-publisher and owner of South Florida Hospital News and Healthcare Report. We're a healthcare publication that's been around South Florida for about 20 years. We cover the people, places, and trends in healthcare. And one of the trends in healthcare is the legal aspects and dealing with health systems. And that's why we have Ben with us tonight. This is a continuing series. We have probably about 24 of these videos on the website relating to various topics. We do repeat topics about every 18 months, just because we refresh them to tell you what's going on. But before I turn this over, let me tell you, I want to thank you for coming in tonight. If you enjoyed this, tell your colleagues to be able to come on next month, and we'll go over what's going on next month towards the end. But tonight, I'm going to introduce Ben Mirza, and he's going to talk about how to approach and do business with healthcare systems. So, Ben, it's all yours.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Charles. Appreciate the introduction. First of all, I just want you to know, tonight's seminar is called "How to Approach and Do Business with Large Healthcare System," and how that idea came about is because I've been on the outside of healthcare systems, trying to work with people on the inside. I've been on the inside trying to work with people on the outside. And nowadays I have my own law firm where I actually do consults with a lot of clients that are somehow interacting with a hospital. So with that said, let me start the slideshow and we'll go through it piece by piece. So, first of all, thank you, Charles, for hosting this South Florida Hospital News, and thank you to the BCMA for getting the word out. And for tonight, about half of the folks on here are physicians, and the other half are related vendors related to the industry. And they're so I'm going to touch on both things. I'm going to touch on contracts as it relates to vendors, and then I'm going to touch on physicians and how they do contracting with hospitals. By way of background, I have a bachelor's degree in accounting, a Juris Doctor from Nova Southeastern University. I have a corporate a mergers and acquisitions LLM in taxation. I also have a master's of public health from Yale. And I've worked for a bunch of different places, large and small, and I've negotiated, thousands of contracts. I've reviewed thousands of contracts. I've litigated close to 2,000 cases. It's just a lot of work experience that kind of goes and builds into what we're going to talk about today. Because I think I've got a pretty interesting perspective. Because I also happen to be a former CPA, a former compliance officer, and obviously I practice law. So with that said, well, let me share screens. Hold on. I don't think I'm sharing screens. So this is the actual presentation. This is a page I was talking to, and I didn't have you guys on. So isn't that great? So for today, I just want to set the stage and start talking and give you an example to think about. And your own product or services may differ, but I want to actually walk you through a software agreement. Let's say that a large size healthcare system, it could be a hospital, it could be a large size enterprise itself, decides that they want to implement a specific software in their workplace. So what do they have to go through to get that approved, right? So as an outside vendor, I think the outside vendors really have to understand, God, it's not just dealing with the administration, but the administration on the inside is dealing with a whole ton of other players. On the inside, you have the medical staff that has to review what is needed. What are the features that they're looking for in this, let's say in this particular software? You have the medical staff directors that have to supervise the issues that affect that software. You have to consult with IT or technology department, like the chief technical officers. You have to talk with finance to see if you've got the funding for it. You've got to talk to contracting, and then you've got to get disclosures from the vendors. You've got compliance verifications to do. You've got a compliance review that's also had. Then the whole thing goes through like a legal review, and eventually there are executive signatures put on there on the actual contract. So it's got a whole conveyor belt that each transaction has to go through. And then once you actually get the signature on the dotted line, then you have to go and make sure that you are interacting and interfacing appropriately with accounts payable. That's what AP stands for, because not all accounts payable folks accept the billing in the same way. Some like it electronically, some like it in physical invoices, some are fine with PDFs. And so you've got to figure out like what's on the inside. This is why I say when it comes to these large healthcare systems, you're dealing with actually a very, very complex animal. And the reason why it's complex is because these large size healthcare systems usually have a double bottom line. One is they have to give a community benefit to the local population. They have to do it efficiently, and they have to do it compliantly, meaning that they comply with all of the governmental laws that are in place. We'll talk a little bit about those as well shortly. And then some hospitals are governmental or not-for-profits. Just because it's a not-for-profit, it doesn't mean that it's governmental, but government typically implies that it's not-for-profit. So you see the reverse there, and we'll talk a little bit about that and how that works up the issues. So tonight's presentation is about 50 minutes long. First, we're going to talk about how healthcare operations work and how the governance works in there. Then we're going to talk about the uniqueness of contracts in healthcare. And then in the end, we're going to talk about Stark laws that may be affecting the way your contract or your product is taken in by a particular organization. And if you have any questions, you're welcome to ask them now or at the end. If it's a sensitive question, I encourage you to hold on to it till we turn off this recording, and then we can talk about it. Otherwise, feel free to ask as we go through this presentation. So let's go through understanding hospitals and healthcare vendor agreements. Now remember, hospitals are literally like a complex city with a whole scientific medical side to it. So remember, each hospital has food services. Each hospital has janitorial and environmental services. Their environmental services are not normal because remember, they have radiation machines, they have specific chemicals. If there's a chemical spill, how do you deal with it? So it's not just any old janitorial company can take care of it. It's got to be dealt with in the proper way because some of these chemicals are pretty harmful or can be pretty harmful. So you got to be careful of that. Then you also have laundry that happens inside a hospital. You've got the bed sheets to the scrubs to what patients wear. And all of that laundry isn't just normal laundry. It's actually contaminated laundry that has to go through a different sort of a process. It's not a normal hotel. This is like very sensitive sort of stuff. There's a whole supply chain issue that these hospitals are dealing with. They've got to make sure that the pipeline of supplies is coming in as they get consumed. And they have to be able to predict that. They have some level of seasonality to it. They have some, like for example, in Florida, we know that in the winter months, there's going to be more people checking into hospitals than in the summer months. And historically, that's been the case. Now, as Florida gets more and more populated, maybe that percentage of seasonal fluctuation shrinks a little bit, but it's probably still going to stay there. There's also things like hurricane. Hurricane impacts the supply chain. So what you'll notice is as soon as winds hit 35 miles an hour, all large size trucks are off the roads, right? So what that also means is that the large size trucks cannot expect to be back on the road for at least a couple of days. And if that's not happening, the hospitals need their supplies for the next two plus days to already be there and on site and stocked. So that supply chain is very sensitive to the healthcare industry. There's also information technology, which in the healthcare space is very different because you have PHI, which is patient health information, and that patient health information has to be secured in a very, very tight manner. And then you also have the other general administrative information. So the information technology in this space is very different. Which also means health record storage is also different, because if you've got pediatrics, you need to keep those sorts of records around for at least 18 years. You're going to have these for kids. You're going to end up keeping their records much longer than you would for an adult. Some hospitals show off arts in their buildings, like they may have interesting and fancy paintings or statues. And some of that art comes in from museums. Some of them is actually rented, and it's changed out periodically. So as you can there's a whole uniqueness to the hospital. I guess that's my real point. There's also ambulance contracts, there's air transport contracts. And what I mean by air transport contracts is oftentimes there might be a transplant team, whether it's for kidneys or whether it's for lungs or anything else. That air transport has to be available when the call comes in. So how do you negotiate and how do you work through that air transport issue, right? There's transfusions, there's transplants. I've come across some really crazy contracts over my time, and some of them, just trust me that the transplants are not as simple as they look. I'll leave it at that. Now, all of these contracts somehow relate to, if they relate to actually healthcare information regarding a patient, there's what's called a BAA, a business associate agreement, which means that not only the hospital has to keep the patient information safe, but any vendor who comes in contact with that information also has to keep that information safe. So there's a whole BAA side to it, to healthcare, that some of you may not have realized, but the BAA is a underlying agreement on many contracts. When it comes to governing of large healthcare systems, there's obviously the hospital bylaws, there's the medical staff bylaws, which are often drafted by the hospital boards, administration, and the medical staff, depending on what you're looking at. There's also rules and regulations. They're not just the ones drafted by the board, but they're also by the hospital board, but also by the disciplinary board. There are state and federal regulations, like, for example, the Joint Commission. You may have heard TJC. That stands for the Joint Commission. There's CMS, OIG, the Department of Justice, the Department of Health, Agency for Healthcare Administration, National Practitioner Data Bank, Federal Drug. I mean, just the list just goes on, right? So there's a lot of agencies, and that's the point of this. The governing of a large-size healthcare system is not that straightforward and simple as most businesses are. So, if you are a vendor or a physician, how do you get into a healthcare system? First of all, you have to identify the need that's inside the system. So how are you going to know that the system has a need for a product like yours? Number one, you got to keep an eye out for RFPs. And when I say RFPs, I mean requests for proposals. And request for proposals also includes request for informations, which is generally, an RFI is used to identify companies that are suitable for that particular environment, for that particular service. There's also what's called a RFQ, which is a request for quote, which generally means if you're talking about a specific product that's got a code number 1111, and you want it to be like this or like that, and you know exactly what it is, you can actually just do a straight up request for quote and send it out to a bunch of different vendors and say, hey, how much are you going to sell me these Band-Aids? Give me a quote if I want 1 million Band-Aids. And they'll have to give you a quote on that if they want to actually participate. So that's what's called a RFQ. An RFP is usually something that's a little bit more complex, meaning it's got multi-layers to it. Each vendor handles the issues a little bit differently, and that's when you look for a request for proposal. Most large-size healthcare systems have a procurement system, and in the procurement system, they will announce that these proposals are coming up. And so you can, as a vendor, you can sign up for those systems and where you go by category, put in, let's say, your particular category. Like, for example, I am registered with certain hospital systems as a legal services vendor, and that's my category. Anytime there is a legal services request that comes out, I get a copy of that. So there's that. Then there's also public announcements and advertisements you could be looking out for. Just know that if you know people inside on the inside, you've got to develop personal contacts. And for me, when I went into this industry, the person who helped me understand that concept was really Charles Felix. Charles was was to me the mayor of this in South Florida. Charles has been involved in the healthcare industry for quite some time, and I think he has his own set of ideas as to how people can get introduced into large size healthcare systems. Charles, do you have any thoughts on that? Anything you'd want to add to this?
Yeah, I think part of it, again, not necessarily from a physician side, but from a vendor side, is being at a variety of different places where you're going to run into healthcare professionals. Too many people network and try to meet people in the wrong places. Not that you don't try, but they keep on going back to the same places time and time again. Just as an example, you have truly medical associations, you have hospital associations, you have individual discipline associations to meet one-on-one people that that are in the business, versus going to a general kind of chamber of commerce, and there's nothing wrong with that, but spending too much time there, you're not really going to build your personal assets within the industry. So I think part of it is letting people know who you are, what you do within an industry to wind up getting those referrals. And Ben and I work with that. We talk about that all the time, where you wind up going to the wrong places, spending a lot of time, sometimes money, in the wrong places.
Charles, I mean, you can spend a lot of money in getting into these circles, all for nothing. Just like, for example, the CPA group that you belong to,
Right.
which is the Florida Healthcare CPA group, and this is where only CPAs in the healthcare space get together. And Charles happens to be a CPA as well, so he is a part of that group. And you have the same thing for architects. You have the same thing for technology folks. If you look up a particular profession or you look up a particular product as it applies to healthcare, I am almost certain you will hit an association you could potentially belong to.
Right, right, absolutely. And again, dealing with something that actually touches and feels healthcare. And believe me, for the last 20 years down here, I spent a lot of time in the wrong places, and wound up going and staying with places now for probably 15, 16 years. And not only going, but the key is becoming part of that organization, being a useful cog within their business, so people know who you are and what you're giving back to that association or club or whatever it may be, to be able to build up your personal, what I call not personal net worth, personal capital for business.
So Charles, what would you say to a person, a vendor who comes into you and says, hey, every time I go in to go bid for business, they pick the big guy. They pick, like, because I think everybody goes with like a familiar brand name,
Sure,
right?
absolutely.
They just
They
want,
not only a familiar big brand. If they don't know you, if they don't know what you're doing, what you're capable of doing, have seen your name in multiple places, multiple times, they don't know who you are. You're just like the new kid on the block. And unfortunately, the new kid on the block, unless you're an expert player, doesn't get picked for the team until you can prove yourself, unless they know your story. And that's what we're able to do. Not tell you, but that's kind of what we've been able to do for a lot of different business, is help tell story and get your names in a lot of different places. And that's important, whether it be myself or somebody else. Having good PR is well worth the money to be able to pay somebody to be able to do that, because it'll come back, not necessarily immediately, but in the long run, it'll definitely serve you well. And that goes for physicians too. If physicians are looking for referrals, if you're in a referral type business, looking for referrals from other physicians, it's great to get the doctor to the left of you and the doctor to the right of you. But what about the doctor that's 10 blocks away or 2 miles away? Do they really know what you do? Do they know you or how you can help them? What new procedure you're working on? What research that you've done? They probably don't. And that's where you have to really get yourself out.
Let me transition over a little bit now. Do you have any suggestions, Charles, for physicians that want to do more work inside a hospital, whether they are a vendor to the hospital or they even just maybe want to go and work inside a hospital? How would they introduce themselves into a hospital system? Any thoughts on that?
Well, I think the obvious thing is, everyone say, well, I just go knock on the door. Well, that doesn't work, I can tell you, because you'll never get in. But there are associations, for instance, like the 2 associations that I've been involved with now for over 15 years, and that's the South Florida Hospital and Healthcare Association, the premier hospital association for South Florida. Touches about 35, 40 hospitals in South Florida. Whether you're a physician or a vendor, you need to belong to this organization because you're going to be at their groups, at their meetings, be a member, be part of committees, be part of councils that they form to be able to be part of the organization. The other one is the American College of Healthcare Executives. That caters to everybody. That caters to whether it be nurses, doctors, executives, whatever. Again, getting to know people. For instance, sitting on the board, there are, I guess, 8 different hospital systems represented on the board of directors. In the board of directors for the Hospital Association, there are 15 different hospital systems or hospitals represented there. Be part of it. That's where you want to be. Nothing wrong with chambers. Believe me, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with chambers, but again, their focus is not necessarily, they have usually a narrow focus on healthcare and a broad focus on just business in general. Why don't you move on, Ben?
All right, so how do physicians get into this? Next slide is about physicians and how do they get inside a hospital system. Really, how this whole process starts is through a credentialing application. You've got to send in a letter of interest. They'll send you a credentialing app, and when you do that, then they go through a whole verification process. And I covered this particular process in great detail in my how to navigate peer reviews and medical staff bylaws. So for those of you that are physicians and on here, that may be a seminar you may want to go back and look at, or just call me and I'll walk you through it, and I can even email you that particular presentation. But really, it starts off with a step number 1, 2, and 3, and it moves forward. And that's how physicians really get inside a healthcare system. But first, it always starts with the introductions. And the introductions, like Charles said, is done through some sort of networking, whether it's foundation dinners or whether it's association dinners. You got to get there and you got to meet people and shake hands. So what are the typical, this next slide is really about what are the common contract provisions that are kind of, that the hospitals are really focused on. And, these were just some of the ones that readily popped to my mind as to what I think that the hospital systems are looking for. But there's a whole other, I could probably triple this slide, and I'm only going to cover this particular one just because these are the ones that are most common among majority of the vendors. So there's what's called a indemnification clause, a release and waiver clause. So you might wonder, like, what the heck is an indemnification clause? An indemnification clause is a clause that basically says if the hospital uses your product and something goes wrong because they use your product, that you are going to reimburse them for all kinds of damages that happen. Now, those damages, if you actually hurt a life and something happens to them, it could be fairly significant. Or you can hedge against it by writing that particular provision in a very limited sort of way. You can actually say, here I am selling you my $100 product. You can use it. Benjamin, I'm sorry. I'm teaching. Benjamin. Okay. Sorry about that, guys. This is my kid. Close the door. So yeah, so these kinds of provisions are really important to the hospitals. And what does release and waiver mean? Release basically means that the vendor releases their right to ever pursue a particular sort of a claim, meaning that they give their right to the other side. What does waive mean? Waive means that they actually give it up completely and entirely. So they not only do they transfer it over through a release, but they also waive their right to be able to actually make a claim. So these sorts of clauses become very important if there is any kind of risk associated with a particular product. So, like for example, if we go back to the software agreement example, the software, making sure that the software is working right, and if it has electronic health records in that system, is it going to save, document, catalog, and preserve those records in the right way? And if it doesn't, what sort of a indemnification or release and waiver provision is needed in that contract? As you can see, like it could have like multiple different variations to it. There's also what's called a insurance provision. The insurance provision could be that each side agrees to carry either X dollars of insurance, like let's say $250,000, or it could be $10 million. Insurance provisions do vary significantly. And when are those insurance provisions triggered? That's one thing. And what sorts of policies have to be carried? So, like for example, for physicians, they have to carry professional liability insurance. But then, what do you do with like medical equipment? Is there products liability insurance that has to be carried? What do you do for medical supplies? Is there another products liability insurance? What if you're only a distributor? Do you have to carry that? Should you carry some sort of a general liability insurance? Should you, if you are a architect or an engineer or a construction contractor, do you have a performance bond that you got to put up? That also would be covered under the insurance provision. There's also a provision called the access to books and records. The access to books and records is often found in government contracts, which basically says that if we get questioned by any governmental entity, we have the right now to turn to our vendors and ask you to show us your books and records, and we can come in and inspect them. And not only that, but you have to turn over copies of those books and records. That's kind of unique. It's a little overreaching, but it's oftentimes there, and it's oftentimes a necessity to contract. There's also a non-discrimination provision that, that's almost always there. There are provisions in there regarding compliance for excluded persons, meaning that the company cannot hire anyone that has been excluded from Medicare or Medicaid. If they're excluded, they will fall out of contract with that particular hospital system. And it's really important to actually understand these clauses because they will be a core part of your negotiation. Then there will be certain things that no one can exactly verify, but they are looking for what's called reps and warranties, meaning that everybody's going to act in good faith, that everybody is representing what they're representing to be true and accurate, because there's no real way to verify that situation yet. So oftentimes what will happen is for an RFP, in an RFP, meaning a request for proposal, you'll see a contract, and the contract will say we are attaching the proposal to the back of this contract, and the representation and warranty that's being given is that presentation is a part of this binding contract. Meaning, not only did that vendor present that presentation to the whole entire administration of the hospital, but the vendor is willing to make that proposal, that presentation, a part of the contract. So as you can see, I mean, there's the provisions go on for long and wide, but then there's also requests for proposals. They have their own nuances within each system. There's also what's called a business associate agreement. If you need a business associate agreement, there's a ton of them available on the web. I have my own version, which is a fairly complex sort of a version, and you can trim that sort of stuff down. There's also what's called a changes in law provision. What that means is changes in law. If there is a change in law that affects this particular contract that the hospital has entered into, that they have the right to modify or terminate the contract based on the changes in law. So, like, for example, these telehealth regulations that have been coming out recently. So what happens to all of your telehealth vendors? Well, as new regulations come in, those telehealth vendors have to get relationships have to get reassessed, and you have to make sure that it complies with the changes in law that are taking place. So these are the kinds of provisions that you look at as a vendor and as a hospital system. Now let's talk a little bit about government contracts and what's unique in government contracts. In government contracts, keep in mind, government has what's called sovereign immunity. Sovereign immunity basically means you cannot hold the government liable for a whole ton of stuff, unless if it is a specific breach of contract or it is a intentional tort. So an ordinary sort of a tort, meaning like those of negligence, are really hard to pass through on the government and blame it on the government. Although it can be done, but the sovereign immunity clause is almost always there, that we are a governmental entity, that you are barred from bringing forth claims of X, Y, and Z type against us. So know that government contracts will almost always have that. There's also a budget that is often mentioned in these government contracts. There will be a reference to a budget because annually there is a budget that is approved by the healthcare system. Now, let's say this year your particular line item happens to be in the budget, but for the following year it's not in there. Does that mean that your contract ends? Yeah, according to actually Florida law and Florida statute, your contract will end because you are no longer being funded. The funds are no longer available at that governmental agency for you to be able to provide those services. So your contract, even though it may be 5 years long, can actually be terminated at the end of that year. So also there's politics, there's government appointments that are also involved. As you might notice in different healthcare systems, there are different boards, and those board people are usually appointed by somebody or selected in some sort of a process. If it is like, let's say, Jackson or North Broward Hospital District or the South Broward Hospital District, those are governor appointees, and it's got politics involved in it and written all over it. There is also what's called hospital districts. Hospital districts like the North Broward Hospital District and the South Broward Hospital District, which is Memorial Health System and Broward Health. Believe it or not, they are actually codified in statute that they can be there. So it's by statute that these hospital districts are created. Like there's even one up in Cape Canaveral. In that whole Cape Canaveral area, it's called the Cape Canaveral Hospital District. So these hospital districts are all over the state, and there's a whole set of statutes that they have to abide by, and the vendors have to pay attention to it, and they have to understand those statutes in order to be able to understand what sort of a contract they're getting themselves into. Now, let's talk a little bit about management agreements. You may have heard of MSOs, which is the Management Services Agreement, and I just kind of want you to understand that MSOs, no two agreements of an MSO are alike. There are multiple ranges. I mean, just far and wide ranges. There could be a high level of service or a low level of service when there is a management service agreement. Now, if there's a high level of service, that often also means that there's going to be some sort of a duty to provide professionals as well as administrative services. When that happens, checking on licenses, the DEA registration, abiding by the medical staff privileges is a part of that management agreement. And so the vendor takes on that responsibility to abide by all of those rules. Whereas conversely, if there's a management services agreement that's entering into a management services contract with a small clinic, it would be very, very different. Meaning because the level of responsibility there would be significantly less. Now, there may be things that have to do with like transition issues. If a management agreement is terminated, does the management pretty much walk out the day that it's announced, or does the management walk out on the 30th day of when it's announced, or does it actually help with the transitioning in of the new management? Ideally, you want it to transition in with the new management. There's also what's called continuity of care that these management services agreement have to be mindful of. And you can actually put in a requirement for cooperation from both sides, meaning the hospital side as well as the management services side. So that's just a management services agreement part. And as you can see, I mean, I'm only touching the tip of the iceberg, but the complexities in it are far and wide. Now let's talk about under arrangements. Many hospitals contract with third-party healthcare providers to service their patients. So like they will bring in like an Envision, or they will that maybe represents their cardiology group, or they will bring in like one of these large size physician groups that comes in and maybe provides like some sort of ICU care. And those are third party healthcare third parties that provide healthcare services to patients. So they often do diagnostic inpatient services. The billing that they do is often done separately. So the hospital bills for its component, that group bills for its component, and that billing has to be handled differently. And there's a lot of provisions that go into just the accounting of how that's done. It's just a very, very different animal again. There's also Stark and anti-kickback statute precautions that have to be taken. And remember, any vendor that comes into a hospital and is considered under arrangement steps into the shoes of the hospital as if they were the hospital. So like, for example, if a specific cardiology or a pulmonary group comes in, or an ICU group comes in, they step into the shoes of the hospital. And now they are the ones responsible for carrying on the responsibilities in that department. So that's what's called under arrangement. So for those of you that are physicians, this may be the beginnings of something that you might be interested in, to see if there's a way to create a healthcare services group that caters to a hospital. Now, with that said, let's talk a little bit about grants. A lot of large size healthcare systems have grants, and these grants usually have a specific purpose. So when they have a specified purpose, those funds can only be used for that purpose, right? And the hospitals and any of its subsequent vendors that are using those proceeds have to provide what's called a rep and warranty that the funds were used appropriately for that particular towards the objectives of that particular grant. This is again usually found in large size healthcare system. Let me walk you through another example. Here's a telehealth services contract, right? So in a telehealth services contract, there may be warranties given. So if there's a telehealth services, are you providing a telehealth software? Are you providing a telehealth equipment, or are you providing the telehealth remote services that are being provided? Very different, three very different situations. Who is the one responsible for each of those components? Sometimes there's a warranty, sometimes there is no warranty. Sometimes there is a warranty of compatibility, and sometimes there's no such warranty, right? So, these telehealth services contracts can vary. And if you're just looking at services, privileging and credentialing is going to be a part of it. So if, let's say, a physician signs up for a telehealth services contract to provide services to a healthcare system, they've got to go through a privileging and a credentialing scenario and make sure that they pass it. And then their compensation can, again, vary quite a bit. Are they paid on an hourly basis? Are they paid on a per patient basis? Do they bill on their own? How is that going to be handled? Very different under each of those scenarios. I know I'm throwing a lot at you because there are a whole variety of issues that come up. Now, last but not least, this is one of the topics I'm going to touch on that occurs in the healthcare industry is, for the fiscal year ended 2022, there is anticipated to be $2.2 billion recovered by the federal government. And there were there's expected to be announced that roughly 450 investigations were carried out. For 2021, it was actually a lot higher. It was $5 billion, and there were 388 investigations. And as you can see, go down year by year, it's a significant sort of a finding industry, and that keeps all of the healthcare providers a little bit on the defensive. And what are they defensive about? Because there's usually whistleblowers involved, and the whistleblowers can be patients, can be nurses, it can be doctors, it could be medical technicians, and even administrators or management. And typically, if any of them decide to report a particular healthcare provider to the federal government will not only fine them, and it's usually the penalties are quite heavy, but then whoever reports them to the federal government, and if they do it through what's called a qui tam lawsuit, they would pick up 15 to 25% of that recovery of whatever the government recovers. So there is a significant incentive on part of these whistleblowers to report things in the healthcare sector, and the healthcare providers are really, they operate very, very defensively. So what are some of the activities that get reported? Paying for patient referrals. So now let's go back to our scenario of, let's say you're a vendor in this industry. Let's say that you are a diagnostics vendor or an insurance broker, or you are a doctor's company, a doctor's service providing company. Are you getting paid for patient referrals? This is an issue that comes up all the time. Is there exaggerated or false diagnosis, upcoding or uncoding or unbundling of bills that's occurring? These are the kinds of activities that healthcare providers are afraid of. Are there discounts and rebates being offered on a particular item? So meaning that, is somebody getting an improper benefit and increasing their referrals because there are discounts or rebates being offered on the backside? So anytime you see a contract that has in it saying that someone is going to get paid on a per patient basis, it's got to really go through the whole regulatory analysis and figure out whether that contract is appropriate and legal or not. So like, for example, a patient referral is usually on a per patient basis. A discount or rebate may be done on a particular line item, equipment, supplies or equipment that's provided, but then again, that's being consumed on a per patient basis, right? So anytime you have a product that's being used on a per patient basis, be mindful of that. You've got to go through a regulatory analysis to make sure that it passes regulatory muster. Otherwise, there could be a lot of fines involved. Now, with that said, recent crimes that have been reported by the Department of Justice, there was a billing for Medicare excluded individuals in May 4th, 2023. There was a podiatrist who was excluded from Medicare, but he went out and he created a brand new entity, put it under another doctor's name, and billed under that doctor. How smart is that? Wow. Terrible, terrible, terrible. Pharmacy billing. 2 pharmacists billed for dispensing pharmaceuticals and over-the-counter products for medically unnecessary items. They also paid illegal kickbacks in the form of rent and giving free office staff services to particular companies. And they even gave cash and supermarket gift certificates. This happened in New York. The first one happened that I talked about, the podiatrist, was in Michigan. The second one regarding pharmacy is in New York. And the third one that I'm going to talk about is in Florida, where 2 individuals, a chiropractor and a surgeon, had an overseas marketer generate leads. And when they generated leads, they were referred to the doctor. The doctor wrote up a prescription, and that prescription went straight to that DME provider, meaning the durable medical equipment provider, and they were both billing Medicare off of this. And that's really a patient referral, right? Sort of a situation. So these are just 3 things all within the last few weeks that have happened that I can report to you. Now, with that said, do keep in mind that there's a ton of safe harbors, not a ton. There's probably about 2 dozen safe harbors that are out there, but depending on your scenario, you may fall under one of them, or you may not, or you may be violating exactly what what the laws are intended for you to restrict. So keep in mind that there are exceptions and safe harbors, and people like Joe Romley and myself, we do this sort of an analysis on a very regular sort of basis. And if you ever need any help on that, we're happy to help you. Now, back to this identifying the need. So where do you get started? You know, if you're looking to do business with large size healthcare system, I think one of the people that I would actually call up is probably Charles and say, hey, this is the kind of product I have. This is what I'm looking to do. Where do you think I should get involved? If you're a physician looking to go in-house with a particular healthcare system, I say, give me a call and I'll help you navigate your way through, and Charles can too. So
Right.
anyway, Charles, any further thoughts on what we touched
Well,
on? And
the other thing is we briefly mentioned that for referrals for doctors, or if you have a doctor who is always looking for referrals, we have the ability through our database to reach any number of physicians almost anywhere in the state with your information. So if you're interested in something like that, give me a call. The interesting thing about that, calls don't cost any money. So give me a call. We can discuss what you want, see if we have a program that'll fit your needs. And if not, we'll have a nice conversation.
all right, great. With that said, I think we're ready for questions. If anybody has any while the recording is still running, you can ask the questions that you want to have documented, and we'll turn it off shortly for the other questions. So we'll give it a few seconds for people to have any, if they have any questions.
Anybody currently doing business with a healthcare system, they're having issues, or if you're in the healthcare system, are you having issues on the reverse side?
All right. With that said, let me stop the recording so we can have
Okay.
a confidential